Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another interesting BATM webinar this morning. First of all, I hope you all had a very good summer, that you enjoyed the time off. And we are happy at BATM that we can start our second part of the year with a lot of interesting topics to address. I also want to mention that our plan at least, let's put it that way, is to organize 4 face-to-face events before the end of the year. Now that the regulations around the pandemic allow us to do so, I think it is certainly time to do again face-to-face networking events combined with education. So our first event will be on the 30th of September. More information will follow. We are in the process of organizing that, but please put that date already in your calendar. And the other event that we have a date for, which we can certainly confirm, is on the 10th of November, which will be our first Benelux event, be held in Breda, in cooperation with Cortas, NATM, and the Breda University of Applied Science. That will be a full-day program. Also there, more information will follow later this month as soon as we have finalized the program. For those people that during the presentation this morning have questions, please feel free to use the chat function. We will be more than happy to address those questions at the end of the presentation. And with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today the topic and the speaker. So I want to thank Advito for the partnership this morning. As you can see on the screen, we will talk about sustainability, which is for sure one of those hot topics that has surfaced in every managed travel program since the pandemic has hit us. And I hope that today we will learn more about how we can implement the strategy around sustainability without losing sight of the other important goals and objectives of the program. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Julien Echanchou from Advito, who is the Sustainability Practice Lead and who will start the presentation in a second. Julien, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Pascal, and good morning, everyone. So as a short introduction, my name is Julien Echanchou, and I'm leading the sustainability practice that we have launched by Advito 2 years ago, and which is working very well, I have to say. We see a lot of interest in the industry for the topic. I also have to say that I'm very positively surprised by the evolution in the industry. When we launched the practice 2 years ago, the clients were saying like, okay, just let me know where I can plant a few trees and I will be green. And now, clearly, companies become more and more serious. They say, I need to reduce my emissions by 50%. Concretely, how can I do it? So it's really a positive move, I would say. And it's important because there is an urgency today around climate change. Scientists make recommendations. So let's see how we can follow those recommendations from a business travel perspective. So let's start. First of all, you may, as an introduction, you may wonder why all this noise, knowing that the airline industry, for example, is responsible for only 2% of CO2 emission worldwide. First, about those 2%, and I'm objective because I belong to the airline industry, but this 2% is a bit underestimated for different reasons. One of them being that we talk about CO2 only, whereas if you look at all greenhouse gas, the real impact of the airline industry is probably closer to 5%, which is already quite high. But most of all, when you look from an individual perspective, you see the figures in this slide. So maybe one good figure to remember for you today, the carbon budget of everyone on Earth, so your budget, my budget, is 2.3 tons of CO2, which means if we want to reach the goals of Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, everyone on Earth should spend 2.3 tons of CO2 per year. And just with one flight, business class, international, here, Frankfurt, Singapore, it's 6 tons of CO2 already. So, which means with one flight, you triple the annual budget you are allowed to. So the goal of this slide is not to say that's a disaster, shame on you, stop traveling, etc. It's more to say, okay, this is a serious topic, so let's see how we can address it. So let's talk about strategy first, then business intelligence, because the way you measure your emission is really important. And then let's talk about communication and traveler engagement, so how you can make your travelers like and accept the, let's say, greener travel policies. Starting with strategy, so what do scientists recommend exactly? So maybe it's a curve that you start to be familiar with. So again, figure to remember, IPCC just released a report 3 weeks ago, I think report number 6. So we have to decrease our emissions by 50% by 2030 to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. This is a decrease of more or less 6% per year. And just to give you an idea, this is exactly the decrease we had in 2020, thanks, if I may, to COVID. So this shows the level of effort that is required. So minus 50% by 2030. And in order, so I tend to think that this should be the goal of any travel manager. So when clients are asking what is a reasonable goal to decrease my emissions, we say 50% by 2030. So a decrease of 6% per year is probably something reasonable because it mirrors what science recommends. So the target is important, but the path to reach the target is also very important because you can decrease your emissions regularly, but you can also increase your emissions a lot until 2029. And then you decrease suddenly, which is of course not the same thing. So you can make different scenarios. And what I tend to say is that the total emissions over 10 years are potentially more important than the target itself. So here you have some examples of scenarios. So some clients want to do a bit better than what science recommends. This is scenario A, a strong decrease in emissions because of COVID. And then still they don't want to get back to previous levels. Some others say, no, I have a little bonus, let's say, thanks to COVID. So if I increase my emissions a bit in the coming years and then I decrease, I will still be fine with science recommendations. Another scenario could be, for example, that you decrease your emissions by 40%, again, thanks to COVID, but you remain flat. So you remain flat. So then your final achievement would be minus 40%. But over the 10 years, you will have done better than a regular decrease of minus 6% with a minus 50% target. So keep in mind, a good target, I would say, is to mirror science, so minus 50% by 2030, with, if possible, a regular decrease, because the path is also important. And how can you achieve that? So the bad news, I would say, especially for us by BCG and Advito, is that despite the airline's efforts, we cannot reach this kind of goal just by traveling better, just by taking better aircraft, taking more the train. And to be very transparent, and again, it hurts me to say that, but we have to travel less at some point. So how much should we travel less? It depends on your footprint, on your evolution. Do you plan to increase staff, decrease staff, etc.? But if you have a target around minus 50%, I would say half of it must be achieved via traveling less and half of it via traveling better. You may count on some new technologies, like a new technological offsetting or buying sustainable aviation fuel. It's an option. But the message here is that technology cannot save us. So it's key, it's very important, and it has to be. We need better aircraft, we need potentially electrical aircraft, etc. But this will never be enough to reach this kind of goals. And once you've said that you need to travel less for half of the effort, it's important to know where should you focus. So we tend to say focus on destinations which are highly carbon intensive. Focus also on short trips. I personally think that the time when we were flying, when you fly, which was my case when I worked by Air France KLM, I was flying a lot, Paris, Amsterdam, same day return trip for a 2 hours meeting. I think this time is over. It's typically the kind of trip that should be avoided. So traveling is key and necessary, but not all trips are necessary. That's the message. And around traveling better, so no surprise, since the highest part of the carbon footprint comes from air, taking better aircraft, flying more direct, or taking more the train instead of flying is where you can expect the highest improvement in terms of CO2 emission. The message here is that you need priorities. If you start to say, I will now rent only electrical cars when I travel, that's good. That's a good step. And there is no small step when we talk about climate change. However, this will not make a major difference. If you do nothing else and you just rent only electrical car, maybe your CO2 footprint will decrease by 1%, 2%, but that will not be enough. So concretely, how the question we always get, how can I as a traveler or as a travel manager be more sustainable? So again, first travel less. And the order is important. First travel less, then travel better. Then use most sustainable suppliers. Some of them are doing real efforts and they should be rewarded for that. And the last one, offset your emissions. And we really tell our client to be careful around that because it's more and more seen as a big greenwashing machine, which it is sometimes. And recent studies say that 80% of offsetting projects are not sustainable. You've seen probably the giant fires that occurred in California. Many trees that have burned were part of offsetting programs, typically of Microsoft. So the risk with offsetting, with planting a tree, for example, is that you never know what will happen to a tree. Still, it's necessary, but it's important to choose good partners, high quality projects, not focus only on planting trees. And I insist on that, I tend to think that companies should not target carbon neutrality because carbon neutrality is a concept that cannot be applied at the company level because long story short, there is not enough space on Earth to plant enough trees for every company in the world. In France, for example, now it's not allowed anymore to say that you are carbon neutral legally. And same in the Netherlands now. So in terms of communication, it's important not to say that you are carbon neutral. You contribute to the global neutrality of the Earth, but the company, from a science perspective, cannot be carbon neutral. So I warn companies around the communication around that because it's more and more seen negatively, I would say. So travel less, it's quite obvious now. Travel better. So concrete example, London to New York. If you have a lot of spend here, we top route of one of our clients. So we say that you should take British or Virgin on this route because they have the best aircraft. They have the Airbus 350, which is the best existing aircraft on international. And each time you take this aircraft, you save 1 ton of CO2 versus if you take Delta or United, which have quite bad aircraft. And remember, 1 ton of CO2, if that does not speak to you, it's a lot. It's what you would spend with your car if you were to drive 20 kilometers per day every day for 1 year. It's also half of your and my annual carbon budget just with one flight. So taking a good aircraft can make a significant difference. So aircraft is key. Routing is also very important. And that tip for you, when you fly Europe to Asia, given the shape of the Earth, so it's good if you can fly direct, but if you can't, it's always better to connect north. When you connect in the Middle East, it's longer and it's much more CO2 intensive. In that example, again, connecting via Helsinki will save you 3 tons of CO2 return just for one trip. And again, 3 tons, it's really a lot. But then comes the question, but maybe Emirates is cheaper than Finnair. So how can you arbitrate between CO2 and cost? Because CO2 is key, but of course you cannot stop looking at cost. So what I think we should all start to do, and I'm sure that will come very soon, short term, is to give a price to the carbon, which is something discussed in the European Union. Maybe you've heard about that. They want to install a carbon tax, so that product coming from far, that we factor in the environmental cost of what we buy. So it's the same story here. So if you suppose Emirates is 100 euro cheaper, if we assume a ton of carbon costs 50 euro, which is more or less the price today in the European Union, then we calculate an environmental cost, environmental impact of flying with Emirates, which is higher than flying with Finnair. And in the end, the total cost of travel, which is a new KPI that I think we should all start looking at, total cost of travel becomes more expensive with Emirates. So giving a price to the carbon is, I think, the right way to arbitrate between CO2 and cost. And we will all have to do that, I'm sure, sooner than later, and not only in business travel. In any activity, I'm sure that will come. So around travel better, so aircraft is important, aircraft type is important, routing is important, taking the train as much as you can is also really important. So on average, taking a train is 20 times less carbon intensive than taking a flight, but it's just an average. If you take a train in a country where the electricity is clean, so mostly made of renewable energy, like Sweden, for example, then it's 50 times more efficient. So it's not carbon neutral because that does not exist, but it's nearly carbon neutral. So it makes a big difference. And on top of that, train has also other advantages that are sometimes not seen, I have to say, by companies and by travelers. So see that example between Paris and Amsterdam. This client was saying, you know, Paris, Amsterdam, I cannot take the train. It's 3 hours and it's 1 hour flying. So it's too long to take a train. But when you look at everything, how much time does it take to go to the airport, to the security check, when you arrive at destination, you are not in the city center, etc., etc. So the total length of trip of train is 4 hours and 7 minutes. And for flight, it's just 37 minutes less. So the gap is not 2 hours, it's just half an hour. And it's a calculation that I find travelers do not do that often. And out of those 4 hours and 7 minutes, you can work or relax for 2 hours and 43 minutes in a train, much more than in a flight. And again, this is not something that is often taken into consideration. And being more productive or having time to relax also has a value and a cost for a company, and this should be factored in. So the train is really a win-win solution, even when it looks longer. Of course, if it's 8 hours, it's not an option. But even starting 3 hours 30 and even 4 hours, it's clearly an option. And this kind of analysis and calculation is not really done often, I find, by companies and travelers. Cars now, simple recommendation is to move to electrical vehicles. However, electrical vehicles are not perfect either. It depends on how your electricity is produced. So if you rent an electrical car in China, the electricity there is made out of coal. So when your battery is empty, you have to use coal electricity. So that's not that much better than a petrol car. But if you are in Sweden, in Switzerland, in Canada, that's perfect. The size is also important. If you take electrical car, but SUV, that's highly carbon intensive because you need a lot of electricity to fill it. The production needs a lot of CO2 also. So don't decrease the size of the car, but keep I would say, similar size. But globally, electrical vehicles are much better. And regarding hotels, the green certifications are important. Some certifications are very reliable. I can quote Green Key Global in Green Key, sorry, in Europe. The LEED certification in the US is a good one also. So you can trust that a hotel that has this kind of certification is more sustainable and quite serious on the topic than a hotel who does not. There are also some airline sustainability ranking out there. So when you compare two airlines, look at which one is the most efficient. The fleet efficiency is key. An airline like Cathay Pacific, for example, they invested a lot in new aircraft. So when you fly to Hong Kong, very often Cathay Pacific has the best aircraft. The sustainable aviation fuel usage is also important. Some companies like United, for example, or KLM, they invest a lot in SAF. So that's good to know. What they do with waste management is important, and CO2 offsetting policy is also quite important. And regarding hotel labels and certifications, so there are more than 200 certifications. Not all of them are reliable, but with this kind of criteria that you can see here, you can get some clarity. For example, if there is no third-party audit, I tend to think that this is not a reliable certification, because the chain certification, for example, they now all have a certification. They are all green. So you have Hilton Green, Marriott Green, Accor Green, and they are making things. The problem is that in the end, Hilton is auditing Hilton. So it's not something, there is no independent audit on that. Still, back to what I was saying, Green Key, LEED, the Nordic Swan certification in the Nordics are very reliable, and you can trust this kind of certification. So remember the story: travel less, travel better, travel with best suppliers, and offsets, which is the last piece. Again, a lot of risks around offsetting. Just there is a huge uncertainty. When you plant a tree, again, it can be burnt. It can die because of parasites, and we have, unfortunately, many examples around offsetting programs that did not work around trees. Energy is potentially a good alternative. However, just so that it's clear, when you finance an energy project, so let's say that you pay, and with your money, you, the offsetting partner, let's say, for example, builds wind turbines in Africa to replace coal plants. So that's good, because this will avoid emissions later. But your CO2 will still be in the atmosphere. Okay, so offsetting is really a misleading word, because when you invest in this kind of project, you say I offset, but in the end, you just avoid further emissions. You see, so the semantic is really important here. And when you plant a tree, indeed, it absorbs the CO2, but it can die. See, so nothing is perfect, and that's why we tend to think that offsetting should really be the last piece, and you should rely on good partners. And a good way to find a good partner is to look at the carbon price. Carbon pricing is really key. Airlines are doing efforts, I have to say, in terms of sustainability, but I'm really not a fan of the offsetting piece, because regarding offsets, now you can fly New York to San Francisco, you pay $3, and you are, I quote, carbon neutral. And that's not serious. So, because it really does not reflect the environmental impact that you have. So when you see a carbon price, let's say at $5 per ton, very likely this is not a serious offsetting project. So a good price for carbon is probably higher than $20 or 25, between $20 and $30 or euro per ton. So carbon pricing is important. If you start financing project below $10, there are good chances that they are not good ones. Buying sustainable aviation fuel, which is not directly offsetting, but can be assimilated to offsetting, is also potentially an option, but that's much more expensive. So it's more around $300 per ton. But on the other hand, it reflects better the environmental impact of flying. And one word on SAF, I tend to think that if you have to buy SAF, it's better to buy it in Europe from a European supplier, because the rules from the European Union are very strict, more than in the US or more than in Asia, in the sense that, for example, you are not allowed to use palm oil or crops in Europe when you produce SAF. So it has to be made of municipal waste or forest residue or all cooking oil. So you can rather trust that the SAF is quite sustainable in Europe, I would say. So that was around the strategy. So just to summarize, we have to travel less to reach our goals, but traveling better is also an important part. And for that, you have many options. And last step, you offset, but only for residual emission, only as a last step, and only with reliable partner, preferably at a high carbon price. Business intelligence now, because so there are, I would say there is a big weakness in the industry today, and you may be aware of that. So the standard to measure emissions are not highly reliable, I would say. The most used is the DIFRA that you may know, or the GHG protocol, which is the little sister of the DIFRA. And they have some weaknesses, especially for air, because they don't take into account the aircraft type. So we have a methodology by Advito, but we are not the only one in the industry, I have to say, to improve that. So I encourage you to use a methodology that factors in the aircraft type. Atmosphere in Germany is doing that quite well also, and Google also launched a good calculator online. So because it's really key. Back to my example, when you take a good aircraft between London and New York, if you report with the DIFRA, it makes no difference versus if you report versus a bad aircraft. It doesn't make any difference. So if you make a lot of efforts, this will not be reflected into your CO2 calculator. The radiative forcing is also key. Radiative forcing refers to all greenhouse gas on top of CO2, because unfortunately an aircraft does not issue only CO2, but a bunch of other gas with a huge warming effect. And this should be factored in also. So a concrete example, here between Paris and Mumbai, which is a top route of one of our clients, when you look, so you can fly direct with Air France, indirect with Emirates, or with Lufthansa. So if you fly direct with Air France, Advito or Google or Atmosphere methodology will tell you it's around 1.4, so maybe Google will say 1.3, but very close to that, because Air France has a great aircraft, the A350. And the DIFRA will tell you it's nearly 3 tons of CO2. And look at number 3, the DIFRA says it's 3.04. Another good methodology will tell you it's 3.05. So this client was saying, I will continue flying with Emirates because it's cheaper, and it's the same in terms of CO2 according to the DIFRA. And here we say, no, if you want to save CO2, you have to fly with Air France. If it's too expensive, because again, costs, I appreciate costs are still important, you have a good alternative with Lufthansa via Munich, but avoid Emirates because it's really the least sustainable option. And this kind of analysis can be done only with a good methodology and not with the industry standard. And regarding other categories, so hotel, rail, and car, a key thing to take into account that again different companies start to do in a good way, I would say, is to look at how the energy is produced. So here on the right, you have the 8 different existing energy sources. So how should you read the graph? If you use only coal to produce electricity, then you need more than 1,000 grams, so more than 1 kilo of CO2 to produce just 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. And if you use hydroelectricity, it's 6 grams, so it's much more efficient. So if you use those factors, if you multiply those factors by the percentage of energy types used by country, so then you get an intensity factor. So here in Germany, for example, they have a lot of renewable electricity, but still a lot of coal. So they have an intensity factor of 388, which means they need 388 grams of CO2 to produce just 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. And so you have this world map that you can see here. So the countries in red are the ones with the most polluting electricity. So concretely, if you stay in a hotel in Sydney or in Shanghai or in New Delhi or in Johannesburg, you will consume a lot of CO2, much more than if you stay in a hotel in Canada or in Brazil or in Sweden or in France, because the electricity there is not clean. And the same in the US, where the electricity is produced by state. If you rent an electrical car in California or on the East Coast, it's green, so you can trust it's a sustainable choice. But if you do the same in Wyoming or in Utah, that's red. So that's much less sustainable. And same in Canada, if you rent the electricity in Quebec or in Montreal is very sustainable, mostly made of renewable energy, and that's key to calculate your emissions for hotel, for rail, and for car, because it's the same for rail. For rail, if you have no, if you have to factor in where your electricity comes from. Train is always a better choice than flight, always. Still, when you take a train in China, it's 10 times more CO2 intensive than when you take a train in Sweden or in Canada, for example. And so regarding hotels, so I think I can skip this part. But again, just to give you a sense, and again, here you have Advito on the slide, but many other methodologies now exist. The message is more than the industry standard is not good enough to measure emissions. The industry standard will tell you that whatever your hotel in Germany, it will be the same consumption. Whereas we say that the calculation also depends on the hotel service, on the hotel category. And if you stay in a luxury hotel with 3 swimming pools and 4 restaurants, it will be much more CO2 intensive than an economy hotel, for example. And regarding rail, again, a key factor I would say is the country electricity mix. How is the energy produced? So the electrification of the railway is also important. In the UK, for example, a lot of trains still work with diesel. Again, still better than flying, but much less sustainable than a high-speed train in Norway or in Sweden. Local initiatives should also be taken into account. In Germany, for example, the electricity is not highly clean, but the Deutsche Bahn, they buy themselves their own electricity. They invest in wind turbines offshore. So they claim they are green, and indeed you can consider they are. So this should be also factored in. In view of time, I think I can skip this part. And for car, you can trust the industry standard, which is a good one. The DFRA is very detailed for car, very accurate, except for electrical and hybrid vehicles, because again, the way the electricity is produced is not factored in. So you can trust that if you rent only petrol and diesel cars, the DFRA standard is a really good one. Now, if you start to rent a lot of electric and hybrid, you need a better methodology to assess the emission. Again, based on how is which kind of energy is used to produce electricity. Another important point that I want to mention around business intelligence is around carbon budget. Because similarly to carbon pricing, I'm convinced that carbon budget will become a standard very soon. So today, let's say you have to organize a team meeting in Frankfurt. You will look at it, okay, how much does it cost? 20K. How much do I have in my budget? 30K. Okay, I can make it. Tomorrow, you will do the same, but for carbon. How much carbon is that? Okay, it's 5,000 tons. How much do I have in my budget? 4,000 tons. No, I cannot make it. It will happen because it has to, again, not only for the business travel, of course, but for any activity. And I believe business travel is a good way to start. So the idea is that the carbon budget should be adapted to the specificity of the country, to your activity, of course, and your plans, your projects. So if you want to I don't know, if you have a merge planned in China, obviously you will travel a lot in China. So that has to be factored in. But the message here is that it's easier, I think, to be sustainable when you are in Germany than when you are in South Africa. Because when you are in Germany, you have a lot of high-speed rail, a lot of electrical cars. Lufthansa has a lot of new aircrafts. So it's easier to be sustainable when you travel than when you are in South Africa with no train, no electrical car, and mostly old aircrafts from the local airlines. So this means that Germany can probably afford a lower carbon budget or a higher decrease in carbon emission than South Africa. And that should be adapted by country, by division, whatever. And it's also important to tell your traveler or your divisions how much they should decrease, but how much of it should come from travel better, how much from traveling less, etc. And one final word on that, on the carbon budget, I tend to think that carbon budget should not be set at an individual level. Because on all that story around climate change, I think a key message is to be positive and not make people feel guilty, because otherwise it just leads to apathy and inaction. So if you start to say, to set a carbon budget by traveler, let's say the budget is, I don't know, 3 tons of carbon per traveler per year. If one person has to fly for a crucial meeting, highly important to Australia, then it will be 6 tons of CO2 just for one meeting. And this person will not have respect the budget, although he may be very invested in sustainability, love the topic, but he had no choice. So it's an individual carbon budget is also a good way to make people feel guilty. So it's feasible, of course, but it's not necessarily something we recommend. But setting a carbon budget at the point of sale or at a division or at the country level is clearly a good option. And the last piece is around traveler engagement. So because it's important to have a good and green travel policy, but it's even more important to communicate that in an efficient way to your travelers, to explain them what a good and sustainable choice is and how they can book use good aircraft, good airline, take more the train, etc. So there are different methods. So you can review the travel policy and make train mandatory, for example. Some clients say now below 4 hours, flying is forbidden. You have to take the train if there is an option below 4 hours. So it can be in the travel policy. It can be workshops, it can be communication on the internet, and it can also be merchandising via some messages in the OBT. So I will show you some examples. So the OBTs mostly Concur and Cytric and get there. They have good options. They are quite flexible, so you can put messages in the OBT, as you may know. And you can put banners, for example, to explain travelers what a green travel is, which is not only around about choosing the right supplier, which is also sometimes around how you can stay better when you are at destination. For example, in the hotel, say that you don't change your Tahoe every day, that you accept that your bed sheets are not cleaned every day if you stay 1 week, etc. So again, putting message in the OBT is a good option, especially, and let me show you an example, especially when it comes to choosing the right supplier. So it's possible to put banners in Concur, for example. So see the example at the bottom. I am a traveler. I type, I want to fly Beijing to Shanghai. So I type Beijing, Shanghai, and then I get a message saying, oh, you're flying Beijing to Shanghai. Then you should consider taking a train and not a flight. It will be less CO2, it will be more comfortable, etc. Or see the example on the right. You want to fly Zurich to Hong Kong. You type Zurich, Hong Kong, and then you get a banner saying, oh, you're flying Zurich to Hong Kong. Then you should choose Cathay Pacific because they have the best aircraft, and you will save 400 kilo of CO2. So it's really a good way to influence your traveler during the booking process. The best solution does not exist yet. The best solution would be that Concur gives the exact CO2 emissions of each option and tells you what is the most sustainable choice. Similarly, exactly what they do today with the price. But no OBT is there yet. In the best case, they have the industry standard, which is the DIFRA, which is not enough to make a choice. So this kind of turnaround, this kind of solution is a good turnaround and is quite efficient. But I hope that within 2 years, maybe, OBT are able to display a good information regarding travel emissions. Yeah, I think I can stop there. Regarding the communication, so here is an example on the kind of banner that you can put. I will just insist on one thing once again around communication. It's that communicating in a positive way is really key. And I'm not saying that because, yeah, we want to be peace and love and that everyone is nice and happy, but because it has proven to be more efficient. There are a lot of research. There is a lot of research at the moment around climate change and around the way we communicate on climate change. Because when you hear the news about climate change, you hear disaster and drama, disasters every day. Permafrost is freezing, temperature is rising. There were flooding, inundations in Belgium and Germany this year, giant fires in California. And then when you hear that, you just want to go back to bed. And this rather leads to inaction. So scientists start to think they don't communicate the right way around climate change, and they should communicate more on the solutions. So it's exactly the same message here. If you make people feel guilty, you cannot really expect that they will change their behavior. So always communicate on the positive way, give an alternative. Don't say, yeah, it's bad to fly, it's 2 tons of CO2, but say, oh no, fly with this airline, it will be better. And also see sustainability as a whole. Keep also in mind that CO2 is key, but it's not the only thing. Traveler well-being, for example, is very important. And this will be my last word. Typically, a good way to reduce CO2 emissions would be to say that everyone stop flying business and flies economy. It would be it's an easy way to reduce emission, and some clients do it. It's not what I would recommend. You should see sustainability as a whole. Traveler well-being is also key. So the message here will be more fly less, travel less, but when you do, choose the best suppliers and enjoy a certain degree of comfort. Okay, it will be seeing sustainability as a whole and communicate on a positive way is, I think, the best way to drive changes and to be more sustainable when you travel. So it was a bit long. It was a lot of information. I hope it was clear for you, and I will be happy to answer any question you would have.
Thank you very much, Julien, for this very insightful presentation around certainly a very important topic. We did receive one question in the sense, does one less or more passenger on board of a plane make a difference in the calculation of CO2 emissions for a given flight?
Yes, definitely it makes a difference, and it's also something that should be factored in. The idea being that the emissions are calculated by passenger, which means if your flight is full, then it's more CO2 efficient. And that's why some carriers which want to gain market share and which have a lot of flights but a low load factor are not necessarily the best options, because basically they need more flights to carry the same number of passengers. So yes, the number of people on board makes a difference in terms of calculation.
Thank you. So for everybody on the call, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat function. In the meantime, I have another question in the sense that we hear a lot about technology innovation, let's say electric aircrafts, hydrogen aircrafts, etc. What will be the impact of those innovations to reach our targets?
I would say the impact will be real, but must not be overestimated and must not be a diversion. And that's always the risk with innovation, is that sometimes you have the impression that will be saved by technology. And my message is that it's not the case. Just to give you, because you have to think about it deeper. So let's take electrical aircraft, because that's a good example. And I'm in favor of electrical aircraft, and I'm happy that there is research on that, etc. But electrical aircraft, there will never be a day, never, where all aircrafts will be electrical. Just to give you an example, let's suppose, first there is a technology issue, we are not there yet, but let's suppose that all aircrafts are electrical in France. Let's suppose it. You have to feed those aircrafts, okay? And in order to provide enough electricity to feed all aircraft in France, should they be electrical, you would need between 20 and 30 new nuclear plants. Just to give you an idea. Imagine we are today not able to electrical car have a maximum autonomy of 400 kilometers. And if we want it to be bigger, it will require a huge electricity. That's the same for aircraft. So it's simply impossible. It will not happen. However, it's a little part of the solution. For very short trips, electrical aircrafts, which already exist, by the way, are a good solution. But do not, and it's exactly the same with hydrogen. Do not think that the green aircraft exists. It will never exist. However, it should be improved. It's important, and it's part of the solution, but it will never be the solution.
Thank you. In the meantime, I did receive one other question. We have seen in the past sessions that the European routes are not optimum due to the fact that the skies are not managed centrally or in a coordinated way. Sometimes airlines are not in a position to choose the most efficient route and are forced to make detours. And just another question arrived, so it jumped. My apologies. Okay. Is there any progress on that point at the EU level as far as one European coordinated skies, I guess?
No, it's a very good point, and yes, there is much pressure from the industry on that, because it's true. We estimate that with a better path when flying, we could save every year something between 5 and 6% of CO2. And not every year, I mean globally, which is something very significant. And indeed, the coordination is quite poor at the moment, and not only in Europe, also in the US. However, I'm not a specialist, but from what I've heard, it has already improved, and there is pressure on that, and I think it will improve, because it's there are many solutions which are a little part of the solution, but together they can make a difference, and this is one of it. And yes, I trust this will improve.
But just to give it a little bit additional feedback to that question, just know that this discussion has been ongoing for a few decades now. So it would be great if tomorrow a solution would be reached amongst all the EU countries, but the chances that this will happen fast, given the history behind this discussion, are limited, I fear. So it's great to focus on the other things that we've learned this morning in the webinar and not hope too much on that front. In the meantime, one additional question came in. The role of the aviation in connecting people, scientists, etc., in search of technological solutions to increase sustainability is substantial. Is this parameter considered in the Advito CO2 ratings?
I would say yes and no. Globally, the purpose of the trip is also very important, but it's more on the hand of our client, I would say. What we make is that we analyze the purpose of the trip, and we tell the clients, okay, this was a training, this was an internal meeting, so I don't know, 50% of your footprint comes from training. So maybe some of them can be done remote. But from my perspective, what is mentioned here, connecting people to find solution, is exactly what aviation is for. It's exactly why we need aviation. So, because aviation airline industry is in the spotlight now, criticized a lot for CO2, but we were happy that airlines were able to carry the vaccine during the pandemic. So we absolutely need the airline, and I don't believe at all in a world without without airline. But the issue is that we have, I think, exaggerated. The volume of flights has increased a lot, and the issue is not scientists who fly to connect each other. The issue is that when you fly, I don't know, Frankfurt or Paris, Barcelona for your holiday for 20 euro a ticket, that's simply not not acceptable anymore. So in our analysis, at least the purpose of the trip, yes, is taken into account, but the volume of travelers and of flights has to be decreased. Just to give you a figure, we had the impression last year that because of COVID that there was no plane in the sky anymore, but worldwide we were back to the level of 2004. See, and in 2004, I don't think we were developing countries. I think it was still fine. So just to give you a sense on how much the volume has increased in the past 20 years, it has been simply crazy. So moderation and in the end, decrease in the offer in the end will be needed, I think.
And I have not received any other questions, so I do believe that we come close to the end of our session this morning. I want to take the opportunity to thank Advito and Julien for the insights this morning. I'm sure that this is not the last time we will be discussing sustainability as a topic. I also want to thank everybody who joined us this morning. Just know that we are recording this session, so you will be able to find this session on our BATM website shortly. So if you want to have another look at the content, feel free to do so. Also, to repeat what I said in the beginning, just mark in your calendars the 30th of September for our first face-to-face social event here in Brussels, and the 10th of November, our educational event together with the other Benelux travel management associations. Thank you very much for joining us today. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe and talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.